Well, we call this the way in Godalming Navigation because it's a mixture of man-made canal and natural river. You can't call it a river, you can't call it a canal, because it's a bit of both. In total, the navigable by decent-sized crafts section is Godalming to the Thames, and it's just under 20 miles. The oldest part of the navigation is the Guildford to the Thames section, which is actually 15.5 miles of the 20, so it's by far the biggest section, and it's also the oldest. What's historically so interesting about it is that it is the oldest commercial waterway in the country, and it's 100 years ahead of the first canal, not just by a few years, but by 100 years. It's an astonishing feat, really. It was all down to a man called Sir Richard Weston, who lived on an estate called Sutton Place. If you're local, you probably heard of Sutton Place. Paul Getty used to live there, actually. Just an aside. And his estate had bordered the River Wey, and he realised the River Wey was obviously not navigable in its natural state. It's quite a small river, and it meanders all over. It takes forever to get down to the Thames. And also Guildford is just under 70 feet higher than the Thames, so you've got fast flowing areas and so forth, and shallows. But he calculated that with a lot of work, cutting out meanders by building canal sections and putting in locks, I mean this is 100 years full of canals, he'd worked out how to create locks, create the depth and deal with a river that's gradually meandering downhill, that he could make it navigable. And the motivation for doing that was that Guildford was quite poor in those days. It was based on the wool trade. I had no access to London because you didn't have roads even in those days. But there was a lot of produce being produced here, timber and barley and corn and flour and so on. And London was the only market, basically. That's where everybody in those days lived, in numbers. So that was the motivation. So he set to work on a project, and it worked out that if he built 9 miles of canal to cut out the meanders and 12 locks, he could create the 15.5 miles into a navigation that quite big barges could navigate and take goods to London. Because obviously once you're at Weybridge, you're into the Thames and then down into the London docks, and then you could sell your produce into London. So he then needed an Act of Parliament because he was going to actually interfere with the river, and he got an Act through in 1651 after several unsuccessful attempts. Cromwell was around at that point. He was a royalist, Sir Richard Weston, and he was very unpopular, and it took him a long time to get approval. But he did, and having waited so long, he put hundreds of men to work just with picks and shovel, basic tools, and they built the 9 miles of canal and the 12 locks and the weirs beside the locks in 2 years, which is, I don't think you could do it today actually with JCBs and so forth. I honestly don't. Quite an astonishing feat. So it opened for business in 1653, 2 years after Act of Parliament. But sadly Sir Richard Weston died in the process, died in 1652 actually, right in the middle of the project, and his son George carried it on and finished it. But it ran into all sorts of problems. I mean, it was pioneering work, nothing like this had been done before in this country. And the overrun was enormous, and it bankrupted the shareholders. Well, he'd put most of the family money into it. The family was bankrupt, and George Weston ended up in a debtor's prison for 20 years, and so that was all the thanks. And it actually completely changed the economy of the area, and particularly Guildford's prosperity can be dated right back to when this waterway opened up a highway to London. So it was rather sad for the family. And just to put it on the map, after the Great Fire of London in 1666, London needed rebuilding in timber. This little navigation played a major role in shipping timber into the capital for rebuilding, because there aren't roads and motorways and railways. Just the Thames and this new waterway, no canals even. They were 100 years away. And Guildford's prospered ever since, and grew, and then about 100 years later, Godalming decided that if they turned their bit of the river into a navigation, they could link up with what already existed. So commissioners on behalf of business interests got an Act of Parliament through in 1760, and they had a very small project by comparison. 3 miles of natural river was usable as deep enough and so appropriate, so they only had to build 1.5 miles of canal. Godalming being 32 feet higher than Guildford, there was again a problem of the fast flowing waters keeping the depth. So 4 locks were built, and that was opened in 1764. So at that stage you've got the full 20, just under 20 miles, comprising 10.5 miles of canal and 9.5 of river, so it's just slightly more canal than river, and 16 locks. So it's a piece of history. I just want to mention one other interesting thing, which is the gunpowder trade. Again, the Stephens were very entrepreneurial. They saw because of the wars, the 100 Years' War with the French, they saw the opportunity. Because gunpowder is manufactured or was at Chilworth, mainly I think because the trees that produce the best charcoal being ingredient of gunpowder, grew in abundance around here. So you had a mill producing the gunpowder, and you had the Stephens family with the barges. The 2 of the 11 big barges were built especially for this trade with no metal parts. So they saw the opportunities, and they would barge the gunpowder in bulk to Woolwich Arsenal. That's a long way. And new munitions would come all the way back from up the Thames and the Ray Navigation, through Millmead Lock and the next lock, and then there's a junction there with the Way and Arun, which is derelict but being restored slowly. That takes you right down into almost to the south coast, but not quite, where it joins the Portsmouth Canal. So amazingly that these munitions could actually find their way to the Royal Naval vessels in Portsmouth Harbour to go across the front through an inland waterway route. Today not possible because the Portsmouth Canal has been built over and it's gone forever. There was a farm on the banks, and the farm bred horses, big sharp horses, very strong beasts, for the barge companies. The interesting thing about the farming is that the farmer was Monsieur Dapdune, a Frenchman, D-A-P-D-U-N, without the E on it, which is clearly where Dapdune must come. And this French farmer was not only breeding horses for barge companies, but also for the British Army, like the French. Because we fought the French for 100 years, didn't we? And of course these big horses were required to pull the artillery pieces and so on.
We just carried on fighting the French.
Yeah, we still do basically.
Agincourt right through to the
right through,
we just carried on fighting.
We still do verbally, don't we, sometimes? When they were building these big barges, they wanted to maximise the amount of the cargo carrying capacity of the barges, obviously, maximum profit. And they realised that a fixed tiller and rudder arrangement would take up unnecessary room in the lock. So very simply, they hinged the tiller and the rudder so that they fold against each other and against the stern. And you can see that hinge there on Reliance. So that way they maximise the amount of cargo that the barge could carry. If you haven't been inside, you do go inside, it's very worth looking. Moorhead.
Yeah, I can never remember which one.
Moorhead with the red and Coos with the white.
Yeah.
So if you could just stay seated till I secure the boat.
Thank you very much, that's great.
We're ready to disembark.